Welcome to True Crime Cases, where we delve into the darkest corners of human nature. Brooklyn Taylor was the perfect wife until she vanished. Without a trace, her husband, William, was left to pick up the pieces, but what he didn't know was that his perfect life had been built on a web of lies. As detectives unraveled the mystery of her disappearance, they uncovered a shocking truth that no one saw coming. The story of the perfect wife turned dark secret would leave the small town of Westbrook reeling, and the truth was more twisted than anyone could have imagined. The small town of Westbrook was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else. Its tree-lined streets, charming homes, and friendly neighbors made it feel like something out of a picture-perfect postcard. In the heart of this community lived Brooklyn Taylor, a woman who seemed to have it all from the outside. Her life was a flawless blend of domestic bliss and social grace. She was the devoted wife of William, a successful lawyer, and the mother of two well-behaved children. Their home, a beautiful two-story house with a white picket fence, was always immaculately kept, a true reflection of the life they led. It was the kind of life people looked at and envied. Brooklyn was the picture of perfection. She spent her mornings organizing the house, caring for her children, and attending charity events. Her afternoons were filled with volunteer work, often at the local school or community center. The people of Westbrook saw her as the model wife and mother. Always calm, always composed, she smiled at every event, attended every PTA meeting, and was a fixture in the local church. If anyone ever had doubts about the authenticity of her life, they were quickly dismissed by her warm personality and picture-perfect appearance. But for those who paid close attention, something felt off. It was a subtle shift at first. Brooklyn's smile, always so warm, sometimes seemed a little forced. Her eyes, which had once sparkled with energy, seemed distant. When she spoke, there was a hesitation. Her voice, a pause that made people wonder if she was really listening or if her mind was somewhere far away. Still, no one dared question her. After all, she was the perfect wife, the model mother, the friend everyone admired. Who could imagine that beneath this flawless exterior, something darker was brewing? William, her husband, was a well-respected figure in town as a lawyer. He commanded authority and had a reputation for being dedicated to his work. He was often caught up in long hours at the office, leaving Brooklyn to manage the home front. The couple's relationship, while seemingly strong, was often marked by distance. William's focus on his career left little room for anything else, and Brooklyn, though well maintained in her role as wife and mother, began to show signs of where she started spending more time alone in their home, often retreating to the quiet corner where she could escape from the demands of her carefully constructed life. But no one saw it, at least not clearly. From the outside, they were the ideal couple, successful, happy, and stable. The cracks in Claw's seemingly perfect life began to grow more noticeable over time. She looked thinner, her clothes hanging a little looser, her face more drawn. She appeared exhausted, as though the weight of maintaining the perfect image was taking its toll. Yet she remained committed to Harold, never allowing anyone to see the strain behind her smile. Her social calendar was packed, and she made sure to show up looking flawless, but those closest to her couldn't help but notice the underlying tension. Friends and family whispered about her exhaustion, but no one dared question her directly. After all, she had it all together, didn't she? What people didn't know was that Claw was living a life of quiet desperation. Behind the scenes, she had begun to feel trapped by the very life she had worked so hard to create. The pressure to be perfect, to maintain the flawless facade, was becoming unbearable. What was once her dream life had turned into a gilded cage, and she'd no idea how to break free. The town of Westbrook continued to admire her from afar, but inside her home, CLA was beginning to crumble under the weight of the secret she was about to reveal. For years, Brooklyn and William Taylor were the epitome of a perfect couple in Westbrook. Their marriage from the outside seemed unshakable. They had met in college, quickly becoming inseparable, and their union had only strengthened over the years. William's career as a lawyer soared, and Claire embraced the role of the perfect wife, taking care of their two children and maintaining a spotless home. Together they had built a life that seemed untouchable. They attended the same church, volunteered at community events, and enjoyed family outings that could have been taken straight out of a magazine spread. But as the years passed, the perfection of their marriage began to show signs of where William was always busy, always working late into the night. constantly meeting clients or preparing for cases that he was the ambitious provider focused on securing their future. But as he climbed the ranks of the legal world, his time at home grew scarcer. When he was home, he was often distracted, absorbed in his phone or paperwork. The once lively conversations between them grew shorter, and the moments of connection began to fade. Brooklyn, on the other hand, had found herself in a quiet struggle. At first, she was content with the life she had built. But as the years wore on, the monotony of her days began to take a toll. She was tired of being the perfect wife, the perfect mother, the perfect woman. The pressure to maintain the image of the flawless family started to weigh on her. The house was always clean, the children always well behaved, and the social gatherings were always perfectly executed. But behind the scenes, CLA felt a growing emptiness, a void she couldn't fill. She loved her children and cared deeply for William, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she had lost herself. Somewhere along the way, she began to retreat into herself. Small, seemingly insignificant changes became noticeable to those around her. She no longer greeted William with the same enthusiasm when he came home from work. Her laughter, which had once been easy and genuine, now seemed forced. She spent more time alone in the quiet corners of their home, staring out of the window or walking through the garden, lost in thought. Friends began to notice, but no one dared ask what was going on. After all, what could possibly be wrong with the perfect life of Brooklyn Taylor? But the cracks in her perfect image were becoming impossible to ignore. When she wasn't spending time with her children, or at one of her many social obligations, she was often found in front of her laptop clicking through websites about escape. At first it was subtle, researching vacation destinations, browsing through new home listings, but soon her searches grew darker, more focused. How to disappear without a trace, how to change your identity, how to start over in another country. Brooklyn didn't share these thoughts with anyone. She kept them locked inside, carefully hidden from her husband and the world around her. She couldn't bring herself to tell William how trapped she felt, how suffocated she was by the very life she had once dreamed of. It wasn't that she didn't love him, it was just that the life they'd created had become a cage. She had become a person she no longer recognized, and the thought of continuing to live the same way day after day seemed unbearable. The turning point came one night when Claire and William had a rare momentous one. They sat at the dinner table, the kids already in bed, but the silence between them was deafening. William, lost in his thoughts about a new case, barely noticed Brooklyn's distant gaze. She stared at her plate, wondering how she had arrived at this point, how she had become so lost in the role of wife and mother that she had forgotten who she was. Her heart ached not for the life she had, but for the life she had never allowed herself to live, and in that moment a thought that had been brewing for months finally took root in her mind. What if she could escape? What if she could finally be free that night? Brooklyn made a decision. She wasn't sure how or when it would happen, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't keep living this lie. The perfect wife had become a mask, and it was starting to suffocate her. The thought of leaving everything behind, her family, her home, her carefully crafted life, terrified her, but it also brought a strange sense of relief. She had spent so many years being what everyone expected her to be that she had forgotten who she truly was. It was time for that to change. The morning CLA Taylor disappeared began like any other. The sun had risen over Westbrook, casting a soft glow on the quiet streets. The town was still, its residents beginning their routines of school drop-offs, work and errands. By all appearances, it was just another peaceful day in a small, tight-knit community, but behind the closed doors of the Taylor household, something was unraveling. When William returned home late that evening after a long day at the law firm, CLA was gone. He first assumed she had gone out with friends, or was perhaps taking a late walk to clear her head. But as the hours ticked by, he grew anxious. He checked the house, her favorite spots in the garden, even the garage, but there was no sign of her. Her phone was missing, along with her wallet and keys. Her side of the bed was cold, untouched. The eerie quiet of the house felt suffocating, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. By the time midnight came, William was frantic. He called Clay's best friend, Olivia, and then her parents, hoping someone had heard from her. They hadn't. They suggested he wait until morning. CLA had been known to take spontaneous trips, they reasoned, but William knew this wasn't like her. She would never leave without a Word not without telling him were the kids. He could feel it deep in his gut. Something was wrong the next day when CLA still hadn't returned. William contacted the authorities. The police were quick to launch an investigation, but there were no signs of a struggle, no broken windows, no forced entry. The house was pristine, as if CLA had simply walked out and decided never to come back. There was no indication of where she had gone, and no messages or notes were left behind. The case was perplexing, and the community was thrown into a state of confusion. How could someone disappear so completely with no trace? It was as if CLA had vanished into thin air. Detective Sam Harper, who had worked in Westbrook for years, was assigned to the case. He began by interviewing William, who seemed genuinely shocked and distressed. There were no signs of trouble in the marriage, he insisted. But as Harper listened, something didn't quite add up. William's responses felt rehearsed, as if he were avoiding something he wasn't saying. Harper pressed further, asking about their relationship, CLA's emotional state, any possible reasons she might have left. William continued to deny that anything was wrong, insisting that CLA had been perfectly fine. Leading up to her disappearance, the investigation began to focus on Brooklyn's recent activities. Her phone records, financial transactions, and social media activity were all analyzed. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the investigation. Brooklyn had been researching topics that seemed odd, given her role as a devoted wife and mother. Searches for how to disappear without a trace, how to change your identity, and even offshore bank accounts filled her browser history. She had been planning something big, but no one could figure out what it was. The deeper the investigation went, the more unsettling the discoveries became. CLA had been planning an escape. But why? What had driven her to seek out a new life? The police were left with more questions than answers. Had she decided to leave her family behind? Had she been unhappy for years, secretly planning this escape without anyone knowing? Or was there something more sinister at play? The small town of Westbrook, which had always prided itself on its sense of safety and community, was now on end. The perfect life of Claire Taylor, the model wife and mother, had begun to unravel, revealing a side of her that none had ever suspected. And as the days turned into weeks, the mystery deepened. Was Brooklyn's disappearance a calculated escape, or had something darker happened to her? One thing was certain: the truth was far more complicated than anyone could have imagined. As the days turned into weeks, with no sign of Brooklyn, the investigation into her disappearance intensified. Detective Sam Harper and his team worked tirelessly, but every lead they followed seemed to dry up. The lack of physical evidence only made the mystery more perplexing. CLA had disappeared without a trace, as if she had vanished into thin air. No one had seen her leave, and there were no security cameras in the neighborhood that had captured any unusual activity around the Taylor home. It was as though the world had swallowed her whole. The case had captured the attention of the entire town, and whispers of gossip began to spread. People who had once admired Brooklyn for her perfect life now began to question everything they had seen. Had she really been the ideal wife and mother? Had there been something darker lurking beneath the surface all along? The townspeople, who had once envied her seemingly perfect existence, now began to speculate. Some said she had run off with a lover, while others believed she had simply grown tired of her picture-perfect life and decided to start over. But no one could agree on what had really happened. The breakthrough came when an anonymous tip led the police to a seemingly unrelated location: an old dilapidated cabin. On the outskirts of town, the cabin was small and isolated, surrounded by thick woods. It wasn't a place anyone would have expected to find Brooklyn, yet something about the tip seemed too specific to ignore. The officers arrived early in the morning, their footsteps crunching on the overgrown path leading up to the cabin. The place looked abandoned, but as they entered, they were struck by the oddness of the scene inside. There were signs that someone had been living there recently: clothing, food wrappers, and even an open laptop. But the most chilling discovery came when they found a stash of photographs hidden in a drawer. The photos, dated only a few weeks prior, showed Brooklyn. She was smiling in some, but in others she looked anxious, her eyes darting around as if she were being watched. The investigators were left stunned. CLA hadn't just disappeared, she'd been hiding, but why and with whom? The most shocking discovery came when the police identified a man in the photographs: Michael Foster, a name that had never come up during the initial investigation. Michael was a former colleague of William's, a man who had once worked at the same law firm, but had left several years ago. Under mysterious circumstances, he had since moved away, and no one had heard from him in years. The discovery that Claire had been spending time with Michael in secret sent shockwaves through the investigation. Had she been having an affair? Had she planned to leave William for him? Detective Harper immediately focused on Michael. The search for him began, and soon enough the authorities located him in a small town several hours away. When questioned, Michael confirmed his involvement with CLA, but this story was far from what anyone expected. He explained that CLA had indeed been unhappy in her marriage. For years she had confided in him about feeling trapped, about not being able to live the life she had once envisioned. Their relationship had started as an affair, but over time it had turned into something more. CLA had told him she couldn't stand the life she was living and needed to escape both from her marriage and from the expectations of those around her. Michael EXP explained that CLA had planned her disappearance in advance. She'd researched how to start over, how to disappear without a trace. CLA had wanted to leave everything behind, including her family. She was desperate for a fresh start, a life without the constant pressure to be perfect. Michael had helped her plan the escape, though he had insisted that he didn't want to be the cause of her leaving her family. But CLA had made up her mind. She was determined to start over, and Michael had simply provided themons. The confession rocked the investigation. The idyllic image of CLA as a devoted wife and mother began to crumble. It wasn't a kidnapping. It wasn't a tragic disappearance. CLA had chosen to leave. She had carefully crafted her escape, planning every detail. And Michael had been part of that plan all along. As the truth unraveled, Detective Harper found himself faced with a dilemma. CLA had made a choice. But what did that mean for the family she had left behind for William? The truth was a bitter pill to swallow. His perfect wife, the woman he had trusted and loved, had orchestrated her disappearance with the help of another man. The revelation left him devastated, confused, and betrayed. He had always thought their marriage was strong, but now he was forced to confront the possibility that he had never truly known his wife at all. The case, which had started as a mystery about a missing person, was now a heartbreaking tale of deception, betrayal, and the unraveling of a life that many had thought was perfect. As the investigation continued to unfold, the town of Westbrook was left in shock. The revelation that Claire Taylor had orchestrated her own disappearance shattered the illusion of her perfect life. The image of the devoted wife, the loving mother, the woman who had been admired by so many, now seemed like a carefully constructed facade. But as more details emerged, it became clear that the truth was even more complicated than anyone had imagined. William Taylor, still reeling from the discovery of his wife's secret life, struggled to come to terms with what had happened. The man who had spent years building a career and a family, believing he was doing everything right, now found himself betrayed in the most personal way possible. His mind raised with questions. Had he missed the sign shed? He'd been so consumed by his work that he had failed to see the cracks forming in his marriage. He had always prided himself on being a good husband, yet he had never suspected that CLA felt trapped, that she'd been planning her escape for months, if not years. The overwhelming sense of betrayal was suffocating, but there was another feeling to relief. As much as he hated the truth, a part of him knew that Brooklyn had not been the woman he thought she was. For weeks, William's world was consumed with the search for Brooklyn. The authorities were still trying to track her down, but she had gone to great lengths to cover her tracks. She had erased almost all traces of herself, cutting ties with friends, changing her appearance, and even using a false identity. The few people who had seen her since she left reported that she seemed calm, almost at peace, as though she had finally found the freedom she had been seeking. But despite her careful planning, Claw's past continued to haunt her. The law enforcement officials had traced her movements to several places, but she was always one step ahead, vanishing into the shadows before they could catch up. Meanwhile, William was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. His children, once so innocent and unaware of the complexities of adult relationships, now faced a world without their mother. They asked questions that William couldn't answer. Their confusion reflected in their tear-filled eyes. He couldn't tell them the truth. He couldn't explain why their mother had chosen to leave. All he could do was hold them, comfort them, and try to reassure them that everything would be okay, even though he himself wasn't sure what okay meant anymore. As the months went by, The investigation continued to stall. CLA had vanished completely, her family, friends, and even the police were left with nothing but the haunting image of the woman who had once been the town's shining example of perfection. Detective Sam Harper, who had worked tirelessly on the case, was growing frustrated despite all his efforts. The mystery of Clay's disappearance remained unsolved, but there were moments when Harper would think back to his conversations with Michael Foster Thiemann, who had helped Claire escape. Michael had always seemed conflicted, torn between helping Claire and his own guilt over her leaving her family. It was then that Harper made a killing realization. Brooklyn's disappearance wasn't just about her wanting to escape a life she found suffocating. It was also about something darker, a desperate attempt to reinvent herself, to erase the person she had been. She hadn't just left her husband and children. She had erased every part of her old life, and in doing so, she had become a different person entirely. The truth was, Brooklyn didn't just want freedom. She wanted to disappear, to leave behind every connection she had ever known. She had built a new identity, and nothing was going to stop her from leaving her old life behind for good as the years pass. Thanks for watching True Crime Cases.